Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring peak experiences and the brain. My guest is Dr. Robert Davis, who is a retired professor of neuroscience from the State University of New York. He is the author of Life After Death, an analysis of the evidence. The UFO phenomenon, Should I Believe? And most recently, Unseen Forces, the integration of science, reality, and you. Once again, this is an internet interview, and now we'll switch over to that video. Welcome, Bob. It's good to be with you again.
It's a pleasure to be with you again, Jeff.
This is your third book now. You've written about UFOs, you've written about life after death, and now we're looking at alternative realities, peak experiences, altered states of consciousness. I don't recall asking you in our previous interview how you got into this field.
Well, I think we all have an innate sense of spirituality, the quest to find truth. I think that persists in all of us at some degree. And upon retiring, I had to find a hobby. That desire, in conjunction with several experiences I've had, motivated me to write each individual book. For instance, when I was in Sedona back in, I believe it was 2012, my wife and I observed two orange orbs in the night sky. They suddenly appeared and then immediately disappeared. And that left an impression. In fact, one of them moved either from behind it or within it and sat motionless for a period of time before winking out. That led me to write the book, The UFO Phenomenon, Should I Believe? So that, in combination with many synchronicities, led me to the conclusion that, my gosh, there certainly is indeed something profound that cannot certainly be explained, that has impacted me in several ways, subtly, but meaningful. Enough so that I am all the more convinced that there certainly is something significant occurring that cannot be logically explained. We don't have the scientific principles to apply to it, and we can't rationalize it. And the psychological community, let alone the scientific community, do not know how to explain it from a physiologic perspective or from an emotional, psychological perspective in terms of how best to manage individuals who are experiencing this spiritual emergency. Collectively, all of these events led me to write my current book, Unseen Forces, The Integration of Science, Reality, and You, which I'd be happy to address with you today.
Well, it'll be a pleasure. And let's start with the work of Abraham Maslow. He's the psychologist who really popularized the term peak experiences, which sort of is the centerpiece of your book. As I recall, Maslow developed the concept because he was studying the most effective, successful people he could find. He looked at people like Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, Helen Keller, and he discovered that they were all reporting what he called peak experiences, intense inner experiences that changed their lives dramatically in a positive way.
The criteria he used as a peak experience for those particular individuals applies directly, specifically, to the types of peak experience triggers, like a near-death and out-of-body experience, interactions with even unidentified aerial phenomena provoke this in many. Influence of psychoactive drugs and meditation also can induce it in some people. But nevertheless, there are common elements that are seen, and he and Stace describe this kind of extraordinary powerful emotional event that transforms their personal viewpoints, their philosophical values from that moment forward. This ineffability of what happened to them, this interconnectedness with the universe, with all nature, matter, reality, their perspective and reactions to normal everyday events are changed somewhat. They have an alteration momentarily of time and space when they are having that experience. And again, I don't know if he's relating that to Einstein and Roosevelt. I don't know if they, again, had a typical kind of peak experience that I'm kind of referring to. There are similarities. There may very well be differences. But this profound joy and love, this ego dissolution that they experience, the sense that I am not the most important thing anymore. I am, but I do acknowledge the greater good, that I'm not the center of the universe, but the external world is something that I regard with a great deal more sincerity, compassion, and I become, in all collected, more humane. And this is what individuals who have a peak experience contend. All of their individual behavioral changes transform them into something I think you can consider as being more humane. Not in every case, and there's a price to pay initially, but they do tend to benefit in a positive psychosocial way.
Now, I know that Maslow compared the peak experience with the classical mystical experience, and he said they're basically indistinguishable. This was at a time in our history when the standard psychological interpretation of mystical experiences was sort of the Freudian notion of regression to an infantile state. And Maslow was saying something very different, because you're looking now at the most accomplished people in society.
Well, here again, we have a language as a barrier in terms of trying to develop analogies, the similarities between what we call a peak experience, mystical experience. I tend to address it as the same thing. A peak experience is a mystical or spiritual, I call it an extraordinary experience of some type that shares common characteristics among one another. And I don't know what the priority is in terms of what is the most prominent attribute or characteristic of it, but they do share common elements. And the types of peak experience trigger events that I mentioned prior also share very common attributes that represent some unifying whole, meaning there may be a common foundation that contributes or gives rise to each one. And I try to, as best as possible, tie it together and try to figure out what might that unifying principle be that allows for these different peak experience triggers. And let's refer to it as a PE, a peak experience trigger, despite their differences, near death, out of body, even an unidentified aerial phenomena, interaction with non-human entities can be considered one as well. This is what people report. Psychoactive experiences. Despite the differences, either externally or internally generated, uniquely different, obviously, they still, nevertheless, somehow, in some way, give rise to very similar symptoms and behavioral outcomes.
One of the classic patterns or symptoms of a mystical experience, or an experience sometimes called cosmic consciousness, is a sense of oneness with everything. That there's no separation any longer. In fact, one with the universe, which is almost impossible to imagine from my small ego perspective, but it's reported consistently.
It's remarkable. It really is remarkable. That might be the number one prioritized feature of what we're talking about, that interconnectedness, sense of oneness. I felt something like that. I don't know if it similar to others who've experienced that, where after my Kundalini experience, I had a strong desire to hug trees. There was just something about it, my recognition that that's a life form. And I feel like I should demonstrate some appreciation towards it. I feel that same way now. I think maybe to a lesser extent, but I don't take things for granted like I used to. That sense of oneness, that is a unique feature. Language doesn't do it justice, of course. You can only understand it once it is experienced, obviously, and that's the problem we have talking about this subject in general. It's a highly subjective experience, and language doesn't capture it very well. That sense of oneness, well, if you talk to a neuroscientist, a hardcore materialist, obviously consciousness equals the brain. And as a result, it must be a brain event. So they're going to explore aspects of brain processes that can possibly account for that experience of oneness, interconnectedness. And so you have some theories about, well, when you inhibit a part of the brain, call it the left inferior parietal lobe, for instance, the individual loses the ability to distinguish external from internal events or reality. When you lose that kind of orientation in space, you get this unitive experience, so the dissolution of one's ego. And maybe that gives rise to that sense of interconnectedness. Maybe that gives rise to that altered perception of time and space, where there is no time, no space, as they contend. The past, present, and future exist simultaneously as they believe, as they feel it to be quite real. And where they also tend to say that they experience an alternative reality, one that is distinctly different than this one. Can brain processes or disturbances of delicate, complex brain regions give rise to those kinds of profound subjective experiences? You know, before I forget, it relates to this. I just read an article. It was just published, and I can't recall the journal that it was in. A published study by researchers at Johns Hopkins University. They did an online survey of over 3,000 individuals who took psilocybin, LSD, and one of the questions related to their perspectives on belief in a supreme being. At the onset of the study, there were about 25% who claimed to be atheists. Following their experience on the psychoactive drug, which included symptoms of oneness, ego dissolution, etc., along the lines we're talking about, 2/3 of the atheists changed their belief structure. They now believed in some all-empowering being. Well, it has to take quite a dramatic subjective experience to change one's belief system at that level. Now, again, is that brain-based? Well, it may or may not be, and I don't think anyone can say for sure.
Well, you cite the work of Jill Taylor, who wrote a book, My Stroke of Insight, about suffering from a stroke. And she also had this experience of oneness that occurred as a result, I guess you'd have to say, of some sort of temporary or maybe even permanent brain damage.
She had a brain damage of the left hemisphere. So the analytic, the language area of the brain was obviously severely compromised. And she was a neurophysiologist, I believe, or a neuroanatomist. So she was uniquely sensitive, familiar with brain function and associated behavioral effects. So while her right brain was fully operational, in absence of the left, she said she had that feeling of cosmic consciousness and interconnectedness with the universe a profound sense of joy, if my memory serves me correctly. She thought that it was such a significant experience that it may very well represent one's ability to distinguish oneself from the brain. And she wished that everyone, in a sense, could experience it, because as a result of that, she had this deep spiritual life experience that changed her for the better. And if you could bottle that up and put it in the world's drinking water, that would be a positive thing, I would think.
It raises the question, of course, as to whether people who are reporting these mystical experiences are actually suffering forms of brain damage, and which would be a way, I have to say, of kind of slandering the experience as a whole and saying, you're a defective human being if you believe that all is one.
That is the paradox. Are we talking about individuals who are seeing a different world, or are they seeing this world differently in a spatial, temporal aspect? Are individuals experiencing momentary brain glitches resulting in miscommunication with one region relative to the other, resulting in some transient psychotic episode? And 1 in 20 people, in fact, do report to have a psychotic episode at one point in time in their life. It's not that unusual. And many physiological states do give rise to peak experience-like symptoms. People with temporal lobe epilepsy, for instance, they have these kinds of experiences. They report seeing non-human entities. They have mystical-like experiences, alterations of time and space, ego dissolution. People who have sleep transition disorders, hypnagogic, for instance. Yes, REM sleep could transition into wakefulness, and one can't distinguish a dream from their morning coffee. And so the bizarre nature of a dream may be perceived as a real event, and they come away with this saying it's realer than real. And they certainly believe it to be true. Then that's not uncommon. But we also see individuals who undergo brain stimulation. William Penfield, for instance, did many studies in individuals who were conscious while various regions of the brain were being stimulated. And in doing so, they reported floating sensations, perceiving themselves from a vantage point above. It certainly simulates like an out-of-body experience. They also have distortions of time and space, sensed presence, which also occurs in those who have epilepsy, as well as in dementia. We see many kinds of these similar characteristics. People who have tumors removed from the parietal lobe all of a sudden become more spiritual, more religious. Suggesting an organic basis again for some of this. But, we can keep on pointing fingers at evidence that suggests brain-based events that give rise to the subjective experience unique to a peak experience. But we have great difficulty with defining with great precision the specific criteria of the altered states of consciousness that we're trying to get at here. What is a peak experience? Give me the detailed definition with precision again, so that I can possibly distinguish it from other types of brain events that result in altered states of consciousness that may share similar characteristics to what we're talking about, but still is distinctly different. So, we get caught up, obviously, in the semantics of this all. And what we need, what we sorely need, is a comprehensive studies of the semantic content of these types of altered states of consciousness generated by different peak experiences, generated by known documented organic lesions and disorders along the lines we're talking about, to firmly understand the unique differences, similarities, so that we can reach some general conclusion about whether or not a peak experience that we're talking about, generated by the near-death, out-of-body, etc., is not unique to the brain-induced events that we know can give rise to altered states of consciousness that resemble, to some extent, not entirely, what the peak experience symptoms we're referring to.
Well, as a neuroscientist yourself, you were indoctrinated into the dominant culture of our scientific society, which is that the brain produces consciousness, so that any conscious experience that you have must be a product of the brain. And I gather, since you've had several experiences of your own and have been researching the field and writing books, you're very open to other interpretations of the mind-brain relationship.
Indeed, I think we again have to be quite careful in terms of defining what we mean by consciousness. The paradox is that we who have consciousness are trying to explain what consciousness is. I mean, that's the ultimate paradox. How do we do that without removing a sense of bias? How do we understand whether or not consciousness is indeed a byproduct of the brain, or is not generated by the brain, but is symbiotic? It interrelates and is interdependent, but persists after the brain is long gone. And we'll never get to the bottom of it, but we do see hints in the evidence, and nothing more maybe than hints, that consciousness is a uniquely different aspect of the brain, obviously dependent on it, interrelated with, but we cannot prove it. And there are endless stream of papers written on consciousness by scholars far more brighter than I, and we still don't have any clear consensus of this hard problem. How does the brain give rise to qualia, sensations, perceptions, reality? You know, we can, the latest research in trying to determine, what is reality? How does the brain interpret reality or give rise to our everyday waking experiences? We can utilize probabilistic algorithms and represent it on a graph as prior experiences certainly contribute, and we have the brain interpreting incoming sensory stimulation. That's obviously a necessary ingredient on a neurophysiologic basis, and then when you merge these two, you get experience. This is what I'm perceiving, and I'm telling my brain to look there or to look here. So in a sense, I'm creating my reality through intention, telling my sensory systems to do this or that. So in a sense, yeah, you create your own reality. It's a way of looking at it, I guess. But the neurologists, the first day in class, they're taught to stay away from the brainstem. You put too much pressure on here, and the person is going to become unconscious. Consciousness obviously is a state of wakefulness to the scientists, neuroscientists. You ask a psychologist, you're going to get a different perspective in the form of cognitive functioning, semantic realizations. You talk to a philosopher, all bets are off. So what is consciousness? Well, yeah. You're asking the wrong person. Well, all I can do is say consciousness. Well, is what's the latest theory? Tononi's integrative theory of consciousness that Koch ascribes to. Everything in the universe is consciousness, and they even have a unit of consciousness. I forget what he calls it, psi or phi, whatever, phi. And well, prove it. But I love these theories, but I think that if anybody says anything definitive about consciousness, whether it being a pure brain event, an epiphenomenon of the brain, or something completely independent of the brain, I think their, if I may say, their egoism is showing. I don't think anybody can say with certainty the definitive answer as to what it is relative to brain function.
Well, one of the things you're pointing out when you look at the wide variety of peak experiences involving contact or communication, sometimes interactions back and forth with non-human entities, whether they're aliens or angels or demons or elves and gnomes, it does suggest the idea of alternative realities, maybe hyperspace dimensions that interact with our normal 3D physical world.
It certainly suggests that because my neighbors, as far as I know, are not aliens, gnomes, or dwarfs. But nevertheless, people can tend to interact with supreme beings and these other types of entities, even the little grays, characteristic of the unidentified era phenomena that are commonly reported. It's been reported throughout recorded history. Ever since we could start putting things down on cave walls, we see these kinds of depictions in folklore in the Bible. Are they representative of dreams? Do they reflect one eating a plant substance that contains DMT, and then they experience these types of beings? But it's not based on prior experience. Where does it arise? Is it from the collective unconscious, as Jung might ascribe to? Why the similarities? Why in terms of beings reported, or beings to begin with, that are non-human in nature, why do people report this? Well, people who have NDEs do so. Certainly those that have reactions to psychoactive drugs do so. And interactions with UAP, characteristic being is the little gray, other types, of course. The question is, what is going on? It does suggest an alternate reality, unless they coexist with us in an invisible reality, as some physicists will contend, like Mikhail Kaku and Stephen Hawking, and they ascribe to string theory, alternative, or the multiverse theory, and that's not that's a popular theory, mathematically, rationally derived. My friend Rudy Shield, an astrophysicist from Harvard University, he regards the black hole as the neuron of God's brain, and it contains all knowledge, past, present, and even future. And I'm not going to argue with Rudy about that. But he's not alone on that matter. When we're talking about different types of dimensional aspects. We're talking about quantum processes. We're talking about principles that have yet to be discovered that can give this credence, this parallel universe, a different time and space that coexists possibly with this one, but at a slightly different frequency or phase, so it is not visible. But maybe we can access it, this sort of 4D, 5D, maybe reality, once we are not limited by the confines of brain function. Maybe that is an aspect of a hint of evidence that suggests, and I'm not saying it does, that consciousness is distinctly different than the brain. When people have an NDE or an OBE, they do have these kinds of experiences, which again says it's a non-brain thing. The brain evolved in this 3D world. It's great for Newtonian physics. It's great at interpreting 3D reality. It was made to. It came out of that primordial soup on planet Earth, not on that other dimension. Consciousness, maybe it evolved in a similar fashion, or maybe not. But whatever it is, people are experiencing a non-3D reality when they have various types of peak experiences. One common characteristic is this kind of interaction with supreme beings, deceased relatives and friends, especially deceased relatives. The question is why? Why don't they interact with their neighbor Jack next door when they're having this kind of? Why only deceased beings? There's certain nuances associated with these kinds of experiences, which is why we really need to boil down, describe with great clarity and definition the essence of their subjective experience to better understand what's going on. And only in a recent study was that done with NDEers and those who had a DMT experience. And the semantic characteristics were remarkably similar between the two. We also see great similarities between the subjective experiences in those who have DMT and those who interact with aliens, so-called aliens, with the unidentified aerial phenomena. And Rick Strassman, the DMT researcher, and John Mack, the alien abduction researcher, psychiatrist from Harvard University, I mentioned this last time, they met, compared notes, and they came up with this conclusion. Same. Are we talking about some commonality? Maybe consciousness, it's easy to say that. Maybe consciousness is a unifying thread to all of these distinctly different kinds of experiences. The question is, are these individuals truly experiencing an altered reality where these beings exist, where the deceased exist? Or maybe they're interacting with the semantic field. Maybe, this radiating, This radiating quantum process that emanates as torsion waves or scalar waves from the human mind somehow interacts with the semantic field, and who knows? The point is, we read so many different theories from so many different individuals. Beyond curious and scratching heads, it's hard to literally interpret these theories as truth. And that's why so much more research, it's easy to say, is required. Because, for one thing, ESP is valid, no question about it. And if those who don't believe it is would take the time to study the literature and talk to people who are successful, able to bend spoons without tricks, and that's valid. I don't know why this scientific community does not embrace ESP as real. It is. That says a lot for consciousness and intention. Likewise, these kinds of subjective experiences that people report, as we're talking about, also suggest strongly that there may very well be a way in which individuals are somehow accessing another reality. Doesn't mean necessarily that the consciousness is leaving the body and having a party somewhere else in a different time and space. But it may not be brain-based. Something else is going on. We don't have these imprints of that experience in our brain, this interaction with supreme beings, with deceased relatives, etc. I don't know where that comes from, and why is it occurring in so many different kinds of peak experience triggers. Point is, if researchers would certainly seriously, multidisciplinary researchers would seriously look at this body of evidence, which is a broad discipline indeed, they would rewrite books in physics and science in general, because someone's ability to bend a spoon, that says a lot, and it's possible. But yet you don't see it on the news. You don't see it in scientific magazines. Weren't scientists born with 2 ears and 2 eyes? I don't get it. That's how much I believe that ESP is real. I have no question about it. And I looked at it as objectively as possible. And I don't say this lightly. The paradigm of realism, again, discounts that event, because reality is only what you sense. Non-locality, the ability to transfer information despite distance and space, is something that is not embraced uniformly within science. And I don't know why. Because it is so profound a result that has such incredible implications. And maybe that alone is why science doesn't embrace it and the media doesn't advance it and promote it and share it with the population. Well, there's more than just PK that's real. ESP in all of its unique parameters, precognition, clairvoyance, remote viewing, etc. They're subtle effects. And we probably are not looking at it correctly in order to get more larger effect sizes because we don't know what to measure. When we're in a laboratory, using the dependent and independent variables that we normally ascribe to, we do see effects that are replicated, that are well beyond chance, that cannot be denied. But nevertheless, the effect size is small, not always demonstrated, but often enough. Often enough under very well controlled conditions to say this is real. This is real. But because we don't have an objective means yet of documenting what is going on, I mean, science wants a physical explanation. They don't like this invisible pathway stuff between mind and a physical system. The Peer Lab at Princeton University, a clear example of consciousness of a group of people influencing random event generators. But once we better understand the essence of the peak experience, the scientific community will gather probably more evidence from that than anything else, especially if they can apply the study of measuring biophotons from the human brain. This may be the physical element that is associated with an aspect of intention or consciousness. And some people say it represents radiating consciousness, leaving the body. We see biophotons, these ultra-weak photon emissions that radiate as an electromagnetic effect that influence subatomic particles, molecules. The question is, what is that all about? And we see it, however, we see it increasing substantially in individuals who are capable of inducing medical healing in others using intention alone. We see it decreasing in meditative states. We see it changing in reaction to different emotional states. Using these complex photomultipliers, biophotons are gaining more attention. And if we can somehow ascribe changes in measurement of that variable to documented aspects of bending a spoon, reported interactions with an alternate reality during a near-death out-of-body experience or psilocybin DMT experience, trying to objectively measure something that mainstream science can get their teeth into, something physical and real, and correlate that with the subjective experience, then we might be in a state or have a way in which we can convince science that these phenomena that you call anomalies are normal. The supernatural represents just our gaps in what is normal. We don't understand what normal is, let alone what is supernormal or anomalous. And I don't know why this divide exists between Newtonian physics and current day anomalies. Well, I can understand at some level the bias generated from decades of ascribing to the scientific method, which is fine, which serves a purpose, but it also results in bias on the part of the individual in terms of what questions to ask, what to look for. And most don't even consider, certainly, the fact that some people are indeed capable of bending a spoon or communicating on invisible pathways with others under controlled and uncontrolled conditions. If they don't acknowledge it or realize it to begin with, they'll never find it. I think my approach is to try to educate as best as possible through my work And I may or may not be successful. I don't know. But I feel that is a mission, trying to reveal what I think is of most critical importance at our current time.
It would seem as if the problem with conventional academia may be a much deeper problem than people realize, is they come to this research from a materialistic paradigm, and any findings that are inconsistent with that paradigm get discarded. So the paradigm itself is self-reinforcing.
The paradigm itself is self-reinforcing. And that may certainly be one reason why not enough effort and time and attention grant funding is given towards research of this type. It's not a high priority, unfortunately, with some exception, of course. But combined with that is the obvious fear of ridicule on the part of the researcher, who may be highly reluctant to delve into this kind of research. And you can't blame the person for not wanting to pursue this line of research, especially if they're fighting for tenure. I mean, how many journals out there or publications are going to accept research in this arena? And people need to publish for tenure, so that's not going to happen. But it does. It does occur, but to such a limited degree. So we need to consider certainly a paradigm shift. And Newtonian physics served us tremendously well. And we still need it, there's no question. But it needs to be countered somewhat. We need to embrace the paradigm of idealism more so, meaning we need to take much more seriously the validity of one's subjective experience, their beliefs, their viewpoints. Who's to say that if I have a near-death experience and I have all of these kinds of interactions with another reality and beings, who are you to say that that's not real? We don't understand how to interpret what reality is. If I believe it is real, it gets down to a philosophical level. But I'm not a philosopher. But nevertheless, if I believe it's real, well, isn't it real? It's like what? A DSM, American Psychiatric Association's criteria for psychosis. And they say, among other things, as long as it doesn't have a detrimental effect on one's well-being and those of others, then it's not considered a major psychological problem. But however, individuals who have these symptoms, let's not label them as abnormal. If their symptoms are occurring within a culture that is accepting of their report that they interacted with a supreme being. Well, what is the APA saying? They're saying that this kind of psychotic symptom is not good in New York City or San Francisco, but it's okay if you're having it in a distant land that accepts these kinds of reports. Well, doesn't that say something about how we define, understand reality? What is it? So we need to figure out as best as possible, and it's not an easy way anytime soon, how to incorporate one's beliefs and perspectives, especially as they relate to anomalous-like experiences, in order for us to better understand the unexplained, because it incorporates quite significantly the subjective experience. Yet it is disregarded as a brain hallucination, of course, an aspect of psychosis or something else other than a true alternate reality or other beings, as people say. And nor am I proposing that alternate realities and non-human entities clearly exist. I'm open to that possibility. There's many theories, of course, that support it. And one of them, or pieces of evidence, is that it's a common symptom in so many well-balanced, lucid individuals who have these types of experiences that you cannot entirely disregard it as what? An abnormality at some level in some way. We must give it more attention, especially, again, the psychological community, who needs to be more sensitive to these kinds of experiences that people have, and don't automatically, in a knee-jerk reaction, give them antipsychotic, antidepressive medication, although they may need it, certainly, for the anxiety that was provoked, certainly, by this astonishing experience that they had, whatever it might be under the umbrella of peak experiences.
Well, it seems that one of the major problems for people such as yourself when you had a spiritual emergency following a peak experience is that the experience is pointing to a reality that is not part of the cultural consensus. So it creates a form of social alienation by its very nature.
It certainly does. Alien nature, no pun intended, I know. And that's why people are inhibited when it comes to sharing it. I even question sharing this with you today. And it's unfortunate that we have this kind of stigma where, although a large percentage of the American population do believe in anomalies along the lines we're talking about, but nevertheless, there's a large percentage that do not, and will label, stigmatize inappropriately, debunk, criticize, you name it. So we remain in the closet oftentimes, and I don't share this with everyone. Although right now, I guess I've shared it with many thousands, and that's fine. That's fine. My colleagues, again, won't understand it, but nevertheless, it should explain a lot to them in retrospect if they look at it. But they need to understand what a Kundalini experience is and what it can do to an individual, and their self-reflection, the self-realization, and the anxiety, confusion that it can generate.
One of the interesting things I think that you're pointing out is that these, on the one hand, we have these spontaneous, life-changing experiences, and on the other hand, we have hundreds of laboratory studies with weak effects, but they also challenge the existing scientific paradigm, and in both cases, whether they're highly dramatic and life-changing or weak effects that are consistently shown in the laboratory, they tend to be dismissed by, certainly by the academic guardians of culture.
Yeah, well said. I wish I phrased it that way, but you're hitting it right on the head, and it is very unfortunate. But it's critical to integrate that information. We have data that's highly fragmented, and no one is putting the pieces together. I don't know if I am. I'm trying to. I may be entirely unsuccessful. I don't know. But it's fun doing it. I hate to look at it that way, but it's now my hobby in retirement. The point is, let's look at the subjective experience. Let's see if there are parallels experimentally. Let's see if there is support theoretically. And guess what? There is, as far as I'm concerned. And that might be a bias on my part. I don't know. I don't think so. But there is a way to integrate it and to give the peak experience more validity as a window into figuring out whether or not this is all there is to reality. And are people having valid experiences, as bizarre as they may sound? People who have peak experiences, one common symptom is ability to communicate using telepathy. They can move at will. Their intention allows them to dictate what they want to do. This thought transference, again, the knowingness of the future. Well, what do we see in the laboratory? We see supportive evidence in the form of telesymmetric events. Two individuals emotionally close or related both put into separate Faraday cages. You give them instructions. Feel interconnected with one another. Well, guess what? Their brains start to synchronize, uniquely associated with their intention. With one individual, you'll flicker a white light. Well, what happens? Alpha EEG activity instantaneously changes at the moment that one of them is receiving it. So, and EEG technicians, experts in reading EEG, says unequivocally, there's no way that this is an error in measuring. It's impossible. This is real. And I have no, materialistic way to explain it other than there is this information transference on an invisible pathway. We see hints of it. We see hints of it subjectively. It's supported by theories of the multiverse, and I'm not going to argue with Stephen Hawking, who's just one proponent of it, among many others. So I'm trying, and even so, even if you can make a storyline out of all of this, it's not persuasive. The scientific community is not going to change their paradigm and consider the subjective experience much more important. But what we need to do is to take people who can clearly demonstrate aspects of the peak experience, aspects of ESP, at will, like the advanced meditator who claims he or she can achieve that dual awareness, the individual who can again modify physical systems. Dean Radin has demonstrated this through his intention experiments, how physical systems can be modified based on one's act of will alone. Well, we got to get statistics out of the equation, because once that's in there, there's going to always be opposition to it in terms of how the data is analyzed. So let's take somebody, I think Lloyd Auerbach, a guest you had, an excellent show, by the way. He claims to be able to bend spoons. I've spoken with John Alexander, who knows people. He knows Uri Geller. You do too, who successfully is able to bend spoons. Of course, a magician can do it very cleverly, but you know what? It can happen. It can happen without magic, sleight of hand. If you can, again, and I mentioned this before, but I come back to it. If we can somehow take one instance, one example of this kind of ability and demonstrate it to powers that be within science and beyond, it should be convincing enough for them to at least consider shifting their focus of what not only reality is, what consciousness may be, the power or ability of human potential, and to seek ways in which we can best measure aspects of bodily function that might facilitate such effects. And again, it might be biophotons, it may be something completely different, but it's certainly not my eyes, my ears, or anything else that I know of that can do this. Intention in some way, using possibly a form of physical energy that is generated within the brain, and biophotons are, it's within DNA.
You point out that really our present-day science, we're so proud of all of our technological accomplishments, but actually our scientific understanding of these things is really at an infantile stage. We have a very long way to go to really get a handle on these extraordinary experiences.
I'm sure there's examples today, few and far between, but all you need is one spoon bender. I hate to keep referring to that, but one telepathic example.
But if you look at the history of psychical research, you'll see that there have been maybe 100, 1,000 great cases, great examples, prominent scientists, people like Sir William Crookes, head of the President of the Royal Society, Sir Oliver Lodge, who invented the radio, and many Nobel laureates who have testified to these things. The force of the momentum of our materialistic culture seems to overwhelm any of these individual cases. I think it's going to take another century of evidence after evidence after evidence to really change things at the cultural level.
And I tend to agree with you, and that's obviously unfortunate. I certainly don't expect to see any change or a level of acceptance of this during my lifetime. It is highly unfortunate that bias will persist in this way, and I don't know, it says something significant about culture, society, scientific paradigm, and then some.
Well, Robert Davis, this has been a enlightening conversation. Your focus on the peak experience as a way of unifying a multiplicity of experiences that people have, I think, is a step forward. And yes, we're involved in a very slow, long-term process, but bit by bit, I think we are making progress. So I want to thank you once again so much for being with me.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I want to thank you for contributing significantly to the progress that we're making along these lines. I'm a big fan of you and your program for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you.